The incredible utility of evolutionary algorithms already implemented in me. So this sounds now maybe ridiculous, but I want to now explain this further, this thought. Sleep, I see as an algorithm. It's kind of like a washing program. It turns my body from something that is not washed into a state that is washed, fresh and clean, one could say. I can then use it again for a couple of hours until it needs to be washed, or let's just say regenerated. So instead of a washing machine, we could say it's a regeneration machine that ideally turns me into a state that is fully regenerated. One could also say aging is maybe just not fully regenerating and then the compound of this kicking in, or rather the process we currently see as aging, not necessarily the going through time part of aging, but the damaging part, the one that is not regenerating through to full capacity. Sleep is now, one could at least say, an evolutionary algorithm. Hunger is another. The maybe movement another, but not necessarily, because movement, I don't know, does not fit into these two things just like the other one. Hunger is, to a certain extent, an algorithm that basically is similar to the YouTube algorithm, connecting the YouTube algorithm is connecting the need on the one side, the demand, with what is given, and it tries to figure out basically the most direct line from one point to the other, or from one point of, okay, there is this video and it needs to be distributed to so many people because so many people have a demand for this video. One could also say it's just to a certain extent economics, where basically the algorithm then takes over the invisible hand in terms of distribution, as described by Adam Smith in his book about economics, and how, you get the idea. I can't explain everything, so I won't explain anything. Now back to sleep and back to hunger. In the last years, I've struggled quite a bit with sleep and also hunger, and also the optimization thereof, or rather the results thereof. If sleep is off, then diet might also be negatively impacted. There often are quoted things like, if you sleep this many hours less, then your sensibility to insulin, for example, goes up or down. I am not exactly sure about this. I read Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep, 2 times. I also listened to the one and the other health podcast, but I now cannot turn out something that would actually be somewhat true. So hunger is basically the algorithm that leads then to satiety, which would then be the final result. But satiety, of course, over time also changes again into hunger. So it basically is acting on a spectrum where you're hungry and then you're satiated and then you go back to hungry and satiated again, as long as you continue to live. Why? Because there is a nutrient demand. So think of it maybe as a house. This was actually an analogy I had earlier this day. A house or an apartment needs to be kept in shape, needs to be kept in order. Jordan Peterson often says that if you are not able to clean up, what are you then even able to do? Paraphrased. Now, as a house continues, there is exposure of the house is exposed basically to things like wind, like rain, like UV radiation, like people living in the house and potentially turning the kitchen or the oven into something that is burning. Now, as therefore over time there is a regenerational need from the house, the regenerational need needs to be met in order for the house to be kept in a somewhat usable state. And the same could be also said for the body. The body is the house in which, in this case, I am living in. I am living in my body as the house that happens to also kind of generate my mind to a certain extent. If I therefore don't keep the house in order and keep it fully functional, my mind also might suffer from this, and therefore over time my mind also might be more and more delusional or something like this, that not necessarily is delusional or in any, it might perform less well. That's what I'm trying to say. If you, for example, take a notebook and you throttle it from the 100 watts it actually needs to 50 watts, then one could expect that it would not perform as well. And if then the same is true for the body and the brain, then one could also say it doesn't perform that well. In the last couple of weeks, I somewhat unwillingly took part in kind of the biggest, not the biggest, in a sleep experiment. And this sleep experiment happened because I happened to be somewhat sensitive for... I seem to happen to be sensitive to basically anything that disrupts my otherwise very meticulously planned sleep pattern. And even if I meticulously plan it, and in the last couple of months, so beginning from 2024 on New Year's Eve, basically I made the decision to, not necessarily on New Year's Eve, but I was able to implement this decision I made a couple of weeks earlier about that time, is that I would try to go to bed at 10 and stand up at 6 in the morning. In order to implement mostly the most hierarchically higher up rule of trying to keep a consistent sleep schedule, as well as using the standard recommendation of 8 hours a night. I recently listened to Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep Again, and so I wanted to try to implement something like this, which resulted in the next couple of weeks having the highest sleep scores of basically me since recording or beginning to track my sleep with 2 devices, Garmin and Galaxy Watch. Now, eventually the sleep pattern got disrupted again. And I also often had the problem that I was not able to sleep at 10 p.m. at night already, but then I additionally had the problem that I was wasting work hours. Because if I'm trying to sleep and I'm so awake that I'm not even daydreaming, then this is time I need to utilize, because often during the day I was then sleepier than what would be ideal. So if I then was so awake at night, I would ideally use this. I often also heard that this now is kind of just a trap in a certain way, where it actually leads down a spiral of, okay, if the body then realizes that you use this time, then it just over time begins to wake you up, because it recognizes this pattern and optimizes the circadian rhythm then for it, and also the alertness periods and the periods of, well, not alertness. Now, eventually what I just did is, and over the last years I tried to basically rationally plan my sleep as well as I could, including all the different variables and measurement tools I had in my toolbox, so to speak. Think of it like, what if you try to optimize your breathing rate for all the time? Then you would have to think about, okay, what would be the ideal breathing rate for working out? What about oxygen? What about not carbohydrate, but CO2? What about this in this specific scenario? Then would I slightly increase, but then what would be the slope of the increase in this specific scenario? What if I then have too little blood sugar because I don't have enough oxygen to supply my heart with oxygen, which then does not pump the blood around in a certain required speed, and so on and so forth. This problem is incredibly complicated, it seems. And so overtaking something like my breathing rate and also my breathing would be incredibly complicated if I would have to do it all the time. Think of it like a program that is open on your computer, and your computer only has a certain amount of RAM and a certain amount of processing power. And so every program that is additionally open in my conscious mind and not taken over by the subconscious mind, and therefore kind of taken out of the task manager, I then have to constantly manage. And so here is an idea. I mean, it sounds obvious, but to a certain extent, it is also very hard to implement, it seems, at least. What if I just go to sleep when I'm that tired that I cannot no longer keep my eyes open? And in between, I just try to be awake, basically. What this resulted in is, in the last couple of weeks, that my circadian rhythm basically shifted and shifted and shifted. And I stood up, for example, today, a couple of hours earlier. I was awake now I stood up on last Sunday, 30 minutes before midnight. I then was awake for all of the Sunday and went to bed basically as of Monday at, I don't know, 2 p.m. or something like this. So I was awake for, 2, 12, 14, I don't know exactly. But I think it's close to 40 hours, which seems ridiculous. I don't know if this is something that it at least allowed me to do lots of work in this time. And the same, now this was just an extreme case, and I just mentioned it probably because it was extreme and I stayed awake this long. But the last couple of days I realized that my circadian rhythm I seem to be awake more than basically a little bit more than what I otherwise would be awake if I just assume the day has 24 hours and I take 8 of it into sleep. What this also allows me to do is just wait for until my body has enough sleep pressure, and then once I sleep very optimally compared to before trying to basically sleep just whenever I thought it was time to sleep, because I now had this next appointment on the next day. And of course, this is how usually it seems there are external demands which you have to meet constantly. And these are set points in time in the future. So in order to optimize now alertness for the set point in time in the future, it seems to make sense to then try to sleep at night, for example. In the last weeks, I was able to run this experiment, and I am obviously to a certain extent quite privileged to be able to run this experiment. I also, it doesn't matter. The rest of this argument, I think, doesn't matter that much right now. Now, what this allowed me to do is now have sleep scores that are kind of similar to the sleep scores I had with the best effort of my rational me, of the best effort of System 2 trying to take over functions that actually are already quite reasonably well managed by System 1. Over the last, let's say 2 years I probably have spent hours, not hours, hundreds of hours, a night awake without basically without the ability, because the constraint was that I would just now try to sleep and not do anything else, and if I do get up I only clean dishes or something like this, even though that's also something that is loud at night. Now there are obviously also lots of problems involved with staying awake through the night. You also might make noise, and also you cannot go grocery shopping, and you might not be able to go to work at night. It depends, of course, on other requirements you have in your life. But the algorithm is actually quite simple, one could say. In terms of the rational mind, I just work as long as I have mental power, and then as soon as I don't have mental power, then my body takes over with sleep pressure increasing, and then I just sleep. And my sleep scores have been in the range of 75 to 85 over the last couple of days, at least when my watches managed to get the sleep tracked properly. My workouts have not suffered that much. I would have expected that this would be much of a bigger problem, that I actually often had maybe every second, every third workout was a total trash workout in my eyes, where I sat on the air bike, for example, trying to now hit zone 4 or zone 5, and I barely managed to get into zone 3, for example, in order to provide the high aerobic part of my Garmin load that is calculated, I think, over 7 days or 4 weeks or something like this. But basically to try to build my VO2 max, or try to increase my VO2 max as it seems to correlate to cardiorespiratory fitness, which then seems to correlate with lifespan, or higher cardiorespiratory fitness seems to correlate with higher lifespan. Now, this is the one part. The other part is nutrient intake. And nutrient intake seems to be so complicated. Electrolytes, getting them in at the right points in time, excluding all of these all of these foods that result out of incentive structures that are basically other people's interest and other companies' interest or other entities' interests that then also have to kind of align with you. If you go to a restaurant, then the restaurant has an incentive to make you come back to the restaurant, so therefore they might put a little bit of sugar into something. The same is true for maybe even something like a protein bar, where there are sweeteners in there, and I at least seem to not be able to manage sweeteners because they seem to override my ability to otherwise sense my hunger properly, which then allows me to use hunger as it was kind of intended. Think of any animal in the wild. Are they fat? Not. Or no, in this case. Most animals in the wild are not fat, only if they are exposed to human food, because then you have these overlaid incentives that are basically manipulating the otherwise. So they are basically obscuring the hunger the real hunger that lies somewhere beneath this obscurance that then creates kind of a fake hunger, one could say. One could also say that by having these foods that are basically, that seem to the body more valuable than they actually are, especially in the long term, one is basically eating at a higher caloric need all the time, because one can eat these foods even if one is not that hungry. And if one is not that hungry, then also one does not uncover the actual hunger and how it seems to stir, at least in my own experience, myself towards eating the kinds of food I have at least selected. Now, there also seems to be a selection problem where if you don't have as many foods as your body would need. So think of a house. If the house has a regenerational need, then if the house needs a couple of bricks or a couple of things that lie on the roof of the house, then ideally it would get it. But if you now happen to have only something else available, then it takes to something else and tries to use it as a building block. But then of course there might be a couple of compromises that come along with this, like putting a brick onto the roof, even if it is not necessarily intended for the roof. So relying on these two algorithms and just saying, okay, what has evolution actually already figured out? And if I just use them as without knowing anything about sleep and so on and so forth, I would just probably stay awake as long and work on the thing I am trying to do as long as I can. Now, what also goes along with this is that a couple of weeks ago I made the decision to kind of go all in again on kind of one project, which is kind of me trying to basically make trying to create at this point in time still my business, which is mostly creating media at this point in time through 4 different avenues, one could say. And so I probably also benefit to a certain extent, at least, from the additional dopamine that is generated because I'm working on the thing that I actually would like to work on. And I also think it is the most useful thing. I basically did, this was not a decision that was, at least in my eyes, based on whether this is something I would like to do, but it is, I think, the thing I have to do, because this is seemingly the only way, or the best way, or the best allocation of my resources in order to potentially turn the things I need in the future into a reality. And so relying on these two algorithms more and more and trying to basically uncover what is actually lying beneath kind of my actual hunger, not my actual hunger, but the hunger I experience, and trying to get to the real hunger that then is actually then nutrient sensing, one could say, and trying to get down to sleep instead of being awake, anxious at night, worrying about how all of these things I'm thinking now I need to write down, because all of these things are problems, and if I don't treat them right now, and also if I don't treat them within the next couple of days, they will reoccur as long as they are not fixed. And so what this allowed me to do is to have just a kind of a orderly sequenced daily structure in which I just sleep, I stand up, I do a couple of other things, I then work, and then I do other things until I'm basically falling asleep again, and then I sleep, and then I stand up again. So this is also a ridiculous, to a certain extent, time schedule. It also seems to involve so many other things, like discovering kind of the novelty of being awake at different times, and also not really knowing where in the day you actually are. But it seems to be kind of also a novel experience in this way. Maybe this is also part of why it is carrying me through like this, but at least in terms of sleep, and not necessarily, this is also maybe something I would like to add. It's not necessarily that I now say, okay, all of the tracking of health data I did was obviously just the wrong approach. No, it is because I now still have the data on this that I can say with a certain degree of confidence that this is actually not that harmful. I can say, okay, my workout performance doesn't suffer that much. It might even, I don't know exactly at this point in time whether it improves or not improved. There is still data to be collected on this. But in terms of my sleep, for example, if the watches I at least have on turn out a similar average of sleep scores, then at least my sleep seems to be not that impacted by this. So the optimization for circadian light exposure or sunlight exposure in order to optimize and synchronize my circadian rhythm with the sun, then if this is also not that important as I actually thought, then maybe I just can run a schedule that is somewhat less independent or less dependent on something like this.